Good afternoon. Thank you all for being back and for returning so promptly from the coffee break. For the second session this afternoon, we have two wonderful speakers. The first is Professor Curt Cadorette from the Department of Religion and Classics. He is a John Henry Newman Professor of Catholic Studies here. He will be speaking on the Jesuits in colonial Latin America. The name of his talk is Eyes and See Not, Ears and Hear Not, and he will be our first speaker. Our second speaker for the session is Professor Alfredo Coleman, who is visiting us from Baylor University. He will be speaking on the transplanted colonial harp, master symbol of Paraguayan identity. Professor Coleman has just published a book recently. It came out in January of 2015, precisely on this same topic, so we are very, very fortunate to have him here as well. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Professor Pablo Sierra. I teach in the Department of History here at U of R, and some of my students are here because we are in the midst of our Colonial Latin America seminar. So thank you all for being here, and without further ado, Professor Curt Cadorette.
Thank you, Pablo. It's a pleasure to be here and think about this creative genius, a transplant, who could have readily been a wealthy musician, court musician, had he stayed in Europe. He chose not to. He decided to become a Jesuit. What I want to do is focus on the world that Domenico Cipolli inhabited once he left Europe, never to return. You may think that he lived a life of tranquil endeavor as a musician, as a Jesuit. To some extent, that's true, but in reality, this part of the world was tense, volatile, and this very tension and volatility would lead to the destruction of the Jesuit reductions. So let's begin with a map that may help you understand the problem. Okay. All right. It helps if you plug in things. I'm challenged by technology. All right. If you look at that map, of course, an enormous percentage in sort of pink, red, is Brazil. It is an enormous country. It's larger than the 48 states here. But it didn't start that way. It started as the tiniest slice of modern-day Brazil. The Portuguese and Spanish realized that they had discovered something, but they had no precise idea about how extensive it was. There were immediate tensions between the Portuguese and Spanish as to who would own what. They went to Rome and consulted with the all-time most corrupt pope in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. The competition was certainly there, but Alexander VI won the prize as the most corrupt pope in the history of the papacy. Rodrigo Borgia had essentially bought the papacy, but that was commonplace in the 15th century, hardly a problem. A number of mistresses, he brought them to court. Number of children, they too brought to court. So, I guess, impressed by his sanctity, the Portuguese and Spanish consulted with him about how they were about to divide up this continent that they were in the process of discovering. First, of course, the Caribbean, and then Mexico, and subsequently Peru, but this is an extraordinarily slow process. Let's see, okay. Any map will do here. Rodrigo Borgia had no idea about what these contentious people were about, other than knowing that the Portuguese and Spanish don't necessarily like each other, probably because they essentially speak the same language, but one speaks it well and the other speaks it badly. So what he did was to draw a line. Renaissance navigators had a good sense of latitude, but had been a developed science. They were not very good at longitude. So the map that he drew only gave the Portuguese the tiniest slice of this continent. This obviously isn't going to work, so immediately there's another treaty signed, which gives the Portuguese a little bit more territory, but even that won't be enough, and they will keep pushing. They will keep pushing to the west and to the south. And this is going to lead to eventual conflict with Spanish colonial presence in what is today Uruguay, Paraguay, in Argentina, as well as modern-day Bolivia. Okay? So now we have a sense of the basic geographical tensions here, and it's important to appreciate them because this tension is going to explode in the 18th century, much to the detriment of the Jesuits and to the indigenous peoples they were serving in Paraguay. The word Guarani really is a linguistic term. This is a catch-all phrase. It's a language that was spoken in southern Brazil, areas of Bolivia, parts of Argentina, and is still very commonly spoken in Paraguay. Unlike Quechua or Aymara, Guarani has survived and flourished in many respects. Paraguay is a very fascinating culture with a strong indigenous presence. So these background issues are important to appreciate. Another important issue is what is going on in the 16th century in the Roman Catholic Church. The obvious dysfunction, the outlandish abuse of power, eventually, of course, is going to lead to the Reformation. And we're close to Reformation Day. I believe it's October 31, and at least in the past, Protestants would celebrate their freedom from the great whore of Babylon, the Roman Catholic Church. It took people in Rome, as it still seems to do, a long time to figure out what was going on. But eventually, and with considerable reluctance, popes decided that it was inevitable that they convoke a council. This council took place from 1545 to 1563. No, it wasn't the longest meeting in the history of the Western world. Certainly not as long as a dean's budget meeting at the University of Rochester. So the church was reformed slowly. And the Roman Catholic Church would have never reacquired its credibility, its believability, perhaps more accurately, had it not been for a rather intense Spaniard, perhaps that's redundant because most of them seem to be intense. His name is Ignacio de Loyola. He was from a noble family with a very long pedigree in terms of coming to the assistance of the Spanish crown. He was one of many brothers, I believe the youngest. And following family tradition, he became a professional soldier. In 1521, I believe he was born in 1493. In 1521, he was at the Battle of Pamplona, a fight between Spain and France, and wounded in a rather dramatic way, typical of Ignatius of Loyola, who did nearly everything with a flair. He knew the Spanish were going to lose. He dismissed his soldiers, and he stood at the gate of Pamplona with his sword drawn, ready to die. Subsequently, he was hit by a cannonball that shattered his right leg. He would never entirely recover. He would walk with a limp, and certainly his days as a soldier, not to mention a man about town, he had quite the reputation, also came to an end. Ignatius went through a period of intense introspection, what we would call today clinical depression. He will subsequently have a vision of Mary and the child Jesus, and that will change his life, and he will begin a pilgrimage towards Barcelona, to a famous Benedictine monastery, Montserrat, and from there to the University of Paris. Ignatius was intent on serving the Roman Catholic Church. And the movement that he set in motion would certainly come to the fore almost instantly. So we have this very intense man who died in 1556 with a few followers, Spaniards, one Frenchman who were attracted to him as a sort of scholar, although he wasn't all that much of a scholar, but nonetheless anxious to learn. And the reason Ignatius wanted to learn was because we have to confront these damnable heretics called Protestants. That requires a good, very good understanding of philosophy and theology. It requires linguistic skills. You have to be impressive. In 1540, the then Pope, Paul III, gave Ignatius permission to establish this order. When Ignatius died in 1556, there were roughly 1,000 members. Today, there would be about 23,000. So let's see if we can find him. There he is. And you know already that Cipolla wrote a Vespers service and a Mass in honor of Ignatius of Loyola. One tough guy. The Jesuits turned into lean, mean evangelizing machines. My students like that. It has a certain cadence, although they don't quite appreciate the humor behind it. So what is going on here? Why does Cipolla become a Jesuit? I mean, we're talking about poverty, chastity, and obedience, and the Jesuits actually do what they're told to do. So why do this? You have to appreciate that Jesuits write journals, detailed reports, detailed stories of their experiences. And these are going back to Europe. And Cipolla sees a hero in Ignatius and joins the Society of Jesus and will die a member of the Jesuit order. So this is the great hero. There's a great sort of psychoanalysis of Ignatius in my office, written by a professor from Yale who's a Freudian psychoanalyst and also a Jesuit. And of course, he's convinced that Ignatius suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. Maybe so, but he knew what he was doing. Jesuits will soon be fired by Ignatius's passion for the truth, for orthodoxy. Yet, because of their education, they're very agile intellectually. And that is going to make all the difference in terms of what they do in South America. So, this man is someone we admire, and we too, like him, will willingly give our lives. You have to understand the passion that's involved here, and I'll use a little bit of Latin just to impress you. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus est. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. Well, there we have it. I hope all of you are card-carrying Catholics, in which case you will be saved. If not, sorry. All right? So, I mean, this is ferocious stuff. And you're trained as a Jesuit to give your life without hesitation. Cipolla knew that what he's about to do was extraordinarily dangerous, but to die for the faith is the greatest glory. As some of you may know, the motto of the Jesuits is Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, all for the greater glory of God. Your chances of making it across the Atlantic were pretty intimidating. At least 25% of ships that left Spain or Portugal simply disappeared. Then, when you land, you have to deal with malaria, yellow fever, cholera, typhoid, typhus, not to mention a small army of parasites. I know, I've had them all in Peru, and they're ferocious, all right? Now, the thing with the Jesuit missions is that they were not opposed to using elements of local cultures that they understood to be essentially neutral. Why not? Their challenge was to translate Catholicism into a medium that these people could understand. If you went to Mexico, you learned Nahuatl. If you went to Peru, you learned Quechua, you learned Aymara. And if you went to Paraguay, you learned Guarani. And I assume that Domenico learned Guarani as he was required to do. I don't know what the policies were in Paraguay, but in Peru, if a Jesuit didn't master Quechua and Aymara, within 1 year, they were sent back to Europe. And you have to appreciate that this is a disgrace. It shouldn't happen in the first place because the Jesuits have a long tradition of finding the very, very best. And it's no surprise that they found Cipolli as a wonderful prospect and invested the training that was necessary for him to succeed as a defender of the faith, but also as a musicologist who had the ability to, unlike so many other Spanish and Portuguese colonists, the ability to hear around him, to see, to hear, to allow the artistic depths of the Guarani to surface, to flourish. But of course, we eliminate all those aspects of their culture that don't fit our model. So this is forced Christianization. But the Jesuits were subtle. The reductions, again, are a result of colonial patterns of exploitation. In 1510, King Juan of Portugal gave permission to Portuguese colonists to enslave native peoples. That didn't happen in Spain, although being an encomendado was hardly any better. You were essentially a serf, but there were certain things that your encomendero, your landowner, had to provide you with: minimal schooling, Christianization, and a relatively dignified life, although that hardly ever worked out in the real world. But due to the predation of the Portuguese, the Jesuits in what is now Paraguay and northern Argentina and eastern Bolivia decided that they had to come up with their own model to insulate the Guarani from the predations of European colonizers. And the model that they developed, first in Peru, incidentally, was that of the reducción, which is virtually impossible to translate into English. But this is a sealed-off community, typically European in its outlay. You have a large church. You have the alcaldía, which is sort of where the mayor resides, and where large meetings are held. And the Jesuits let the Guarani be Guarani. They did not interfere with their own patterns of governance, their own values when it came to the life of that community. Any reduction would have had 2 Jesuits in residence, but otherwise these were entirely indigenous communities. That's why Guarani has survived to this day in Paraguay. And these reductions proved to be very efficient. Stereotypes to the contrary, these indigenous people were extremely disciplined, tough, and understood the value of community intrinsically in ways that in our atomized Western world simply seem incomprehensible. The reductions very quickly became moneymakers. And of course, that is going to be part of the problem. Okay? Let's go back here. So, I'm technologically challenged, as I've already admitted. Let me see here. Okay. This is in Bolivia, I believe, okay? And this is a fascinating Jesuit church. It was reconstructed with UNESCO funds. And in some respects, it looks typically Spanish, but then again, it really isn't. The Jesuits certainly understood that Paraguay is hotter than hell in the summer, and the humidity is unbearable. So they constructed churches that were open. Cipolli went to these missions, although he didn't have the physical stamina to be present all of the time. So he would have spent most of his life in Córdoba and trained indigenous students. The way it worked was, in these communities, there were schools for both boys and girls, and the Jesuits found the very, very best. It was sort of a Platonic endeavor, a Platonic world of education in which the most astute were allowed to move on. And they did. They were sent to Asunción. They were sent to Buenos Aires. And they flourished. But because of the success of the reductions, particularly on an economic level, they quickly began to cultivate yerba mate, which is an indispensable part of culture even today. Paraguayans don't take coffee breaks, they take mate breaks, all right? Everyone has their gourd and their silver straw. These are indispensable parts of life, and I imagine Cipolli had his fair share of yerba mate. They produced tobacco, they produced hardwoods from the jungle of exquisite quality, and soon produced some of the finest instruments available. Some actually exported back to Europe. Why did these idyllic utopian communities cease to exist? Well, I'll end as I began. It's politics. There is a dark side to the Enlightenment that historians are certainly aware of. There was, among certain Enlightenment figures, a certain antipathy towards the Catholic Church, understandable, and a specific antipathy towards the Jesuits, who had become very powerful. They ran most of the elite schools in France, most of the elite schools in the Iberian Peninsula. These people had power. They were confessors to kings and queens, and I suspect rather busy because they were. The tension exploded, fueled by the Enlightenment, but more so fueled by the greed of colonists who simply didn't like the competition. So beginning in 1760, the Jesuit reductions are attacked, subsequently destroyed, but the culture survives to the present. Attenuated, changed, of course, but still vibrant, still alive. And in many ways, we can thank people like Cipolli and the other Jesuits who gave their lives for indigenous peoples. Of course, this is a dicey proposition. One can accuse them of imposing their religion, but they were utterly compelled to do so in light of their beliefs. And in the process, someone like Domenico Cipolli produced exquisitely beautiful music. And he didn't do that in a vacuum. He did it because of the people who surrounded him. He realized that the Guarani understanding of the world was something beautiful. And that's his legacy that we're celebrating today. Thank you.
We have time for a quick round of questions and then move on to Professor Coleman. Professor Cadorette. There's a great deal of investment in learning Guarani. There's a series of grammars, Arte de la Lengua Guarani, and they are published in actually pretty early on, 1630s and 1640s, which is when Brazilians are coming through what is now the city of Sao Paulo and enslaving Guarani people. These treatises are published in Madrid, of all places. And in the 1720s, actually in 1724, they are republished in the missions of what is today northeastern Argentina. And so I guess I'm wondering if you consider that there's a spirit of defending Guarani culture that Zipoli is drawing into. The fact that these treatises, these grammars are 100 years old, and they're being published just as he is arriving and composing music.
Right.
Is it possible to see some kind of synergy there between studying indigenous languages, producing music for the same people, and advancing the Jesuit culture?
One of the first things that Jesuits did was to try to create grammars and dictionaries of the languages that surrounded them. And of course, the purpose is to speak Guarani or speak Quechua or Aymara in fluent ways that allow you to interact with these people. But speaking from experience, I suspect that Zipoli fell in love with the Guarani people. It's in some ways that simple. Their way of life was enticing. He realized that so many of the stereotypes that had been drilled into his head as a European made no sense. They had no connection with reality. So if you're going to stay in this rather difficult environment, you have to have some sort of emotional source, some emotional energy that's going to help you through the good days and the bad days. And of course, there are many bad days in this environment. But Zipoli had a certain love, if you will, for these people. All of the Jesuits suffered from a certain degree of Eurocentrism. Nonetheless, those who survived in the missions learned to love the people with whom they lived. And to go back to that 1991 movie, The Mission, there were a spate of Jesuit movies in '86 about the French Jesuits in Canada, and then 91, I believe, The Mission itself. What you see with all those Jesuits, although this, of course, is sort of a romance and it's not all that factual, but nonetheless, they all began to love these people, interact with them, enjoy their humanness. So their own stereotypes of these people as somehow deficient is simply gone. Their affection is unconditional to the point of death. And Jesuits did die in suppression of these reductions. Okay?
Any other questions? Not?
Okay.
Professor Cadorette.
Yes,
Department of History here at U of R, and some of my students are here because we are in the midst of our Colonial Latin America seminar. So thank you all for being here, and without further ado, Professor Curt Cadorette.
Thank you, Pablo. It's a pleasure to be here and think about this creative genius, a transplant, who could have readily been a wealthy musician, court musician, had he stayed in Europe. He chose not to. He decided to become a Jesuit. What I want to do is focus on the world that Domenico Sipoli inhabited once he left Europe, never to return. You may think that he lived a life of tranquil endeavor as a musician, as a Jesuit. To some extent that's true, but it
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being back and for returning so promptly from the coffee break. For the second session this afternoon, we have two wonderful speakers. The first is Professor Curt Cadorette from the Department of Religion and Classics. He is a John Henry Newman Professor of Catholic Studies here. He will be speaking on the Jesuits in colonial Latin America. The name of his talk.
in reality, this part of the world was tense, volatile, and this very tension and volatility would lead to the destruction of the Jesuit reductions. So let's begin with a map that may help you understand the problem. Okay. All right.
His eyes and see not, ears and hear not, and he will be our first speaker. Our second speaker for the session is Professor Alfredo Coleman, who is visiting us from Baylor University. He will be speaking on the transplanted colonial harp, master symbol of Paraguayan identity. Professor Coleman has just published a book recently. It came out in January of 2015, precisely on this same topic. So we are very, very fortunate to have him here as well. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Professor Pablo Sierra. I teach in the department.